Welcome to State of Open, the UK in 2022. I'm Amanda Brock. I'm the CEO at Open UK, and Open UK is the industry organisation for the business of open technology in the UK. That's open source software, open hardware, and open data. Our vision is UK leadership and global collaboration in open technology, and this is the second year of our State of Open reporting. Today, we're inviting you to join us for a digital drinks, and I hope that you will enjoy being with us this afternoon as I introduce you to the report and to our partner, Dr. Jennifer Barth of Smooth Media. In this second year, we had planned a phase one report, and as we worked through this, although we achieved our goals of a literature review, a survey, and case studies, we decided that it needed much more. We realised that we need to drill down more into certain topics, and we'll be doing further phases that we'll talk to you more about. Now, what I'm seeing in the marketplace today is that open source has become the dominant force in software development and software in our digital economy. And that spans from the enterprise all the way across the public sector and government. This has led to us focusing on three things: infrastructure, the curation of infrastructure and code, and security. And we'll talk more about those as we go through today's session. We also, as we started in this survey and in the reporting that we're doing this year, focus on the journey to open source, the subject of this phase one of Open UK's State of Open.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you so much for having me here today. Smooth Media is a small group of academics and researchers looking at the intersections of emerging technology and socioeconomic impact. And we produce independent research for thought leadership and PR. Our team of economists and data scientists and social researchers includes Dr. Eurydice Fotopoulou and Arija Sun. And I really want to thank the team for so much hard work and dedication to good research in this project. Thanks for having us here today.
Thanks, Jen. We're going to spend about 20 minutes today discussing our report, and at the end there will be an opportunity for Q&A. So please put your questions in the chat as we go through the session, and we'll pick those up at the end. But also feel free to share on social media anything about this discussion, about the report, or about your questions, and that's with the hashtag State of Open. You'll find us on Twitter at OpenUK_UK. Now, Jen, we've shared an infographic with 9 key facts from our report. Why don't we start by looking at that? These facts are largely based on our second survey, and the report is also supported with case studies and interesting thought leadership.
Exactly. The research used a mixed method approach, case studies, interviews, and the survey to explore and demonstrate the evolving journey of open source software. We collected 243 responses, which resulted in a sample of 211 valid answers from private and the public sector in the UK. We did that from middle of May to middle of June and through the Open UK networks.
I think it's notable that over 50% were in the tech sector, but actually almost 50% were not.
Absolutely. And I think previously, you always struggle when you get into this conversation to move beyond the tech sector and to get more people who are using open. We've really found a way to do that through the case studies. I think, drawing from different sectors to show how people are using open source software in their work across sectors. But we did, as you say, see that across the survey respondents. So it was a great outreach, and thank you to everyone who participated in the survey, because we've got some really robust responses. The UK enterprise spends 4.87, somewhere between 4.87 to 5.56 billion pounds on open source software. And that's the total investment by enterprise in the UK in 2021. So this level, just to give you some context, this level of investment is 29 to 35 times more than the UK government spending on improvement of the UK's digital infrastructure as part of the levelling up agenda. We toyed around a lot with coming to this number, because last year, as many of you may remember, we tried to look at what the whole economy looked like in relation to open source software. This year we tried something different to really focus in on what organizations were doing and what that investment in open source software looked like. So of course we used data collected in the survey, and we were able to estimate time spent on open source software by organization size and the amount of investment by organizations. So it's sort of the labor input and the capital input. And this is really consistent with the way software investment flows are measured internationally and can be replicated without reliance on externally or possibly commercially sensitive data. So we're really, really proud of the numbers we've come up with. And of course, this shows the enormous transformative potential open source software has for the UK economy and how it could lead to world-class innovation. I'm going to move on now to the second point, which is that we saw 11.9 million open source software package downloads in UK for the first half of 2022. Now, this is data according to SCARF. It comprises pulls of Docker containers, NPM packages, executables, and other raw file archives. And we know that this is only the tip of the iceberg. We're trying to find some way to show you just how massive this is. So the fact that much of this activity is not fully captured in this number makes putting a monetary value to the work done in open source software. Our third point is around security, which of course in our previous reports we spoke about, and then we have a section in this report specifically on where we are with security, which we'll come to a bit later. But 78% of respondents believe that open source software is not a greater security risk than proprietary. And I think that we saw similar findings in Red Hat's recent work, and just generally that this is a significant shift from mainstream perceptions about open source software from, say, 10 years or so ago, when open source software security was often surfaced as a weakness. We saw 100% of organizations that are less than 3 years old in our survey are using open source software. Fifth point, 41% of companies collaborate with competitors in open source, which we call co-opetition. So there's a level of cooperation with competitor organizations in the UK open source software environment that is unusual in the marketplace. I mean, in terms of the open source software journey more broadly, that we saw a real relationship between moving from consuming to consuming and contributing, and how that starts to bring people into more and more collaborations, more relationships, more networks, and it tends to increase the awareness of the open source community, so leading to that sort of enhancement of code and skills and conversation. So that we see that, and the UK, as we'll talk about later, is quite mature in its use, so we can see how those collaborations are mature as well. Overall, we saw 94% collaboration among this community, so very high levels of collaboration. Number 6, 27% of UK organizations contributed to open source software for more than 10 years. So we worked across some times, which we'll come back to as well. And we looked at the maturity, how long you had been interacting in some way with open source software, and how that affected some of the points we were trying to show around governance, good hygiene, and where you are on the journey. So the length of time that organizations have engaged with open source software in each activity, so consuming, contributing, and distributing of products, shows an upward trend. It's not as high as we might have hoped to be at 27%, but this could possibly be that established organizations are more likely to find themselves in long-term lock-in, especially legacy systems that cannot be easily made redundant or replaced. And I think a general sense that if you look at how much things have changed over the last 10 years, if you've been using it for more than 10 years, you might be just catching up to some of the newer things in the way it's so integrated in your organization that you're just moving forward. Top 3 benefits at number 7, cost saving, collaboration, and the community. So all things we've been talking about here. We also saw things like better quality of code, innovation, agility, and there's a link we see between the duration of usage or of consuming and contributing and distributing open source software and the benefits gained from it. So community contributions matter the most for those with 4 to 6 years of engagement. 7 to 10 years of experience in open source software put collaboration at the top of their list. Number 8, the challenges. We couldn't talk about the benefits without talking about the challenges. So the cost remains a stubborn problem up there, with cost of maintenance and security is number 1, participation costs number 2, and lack of coding and technical knowledge. So the skills gap. And finally, number 9, the top 3 roles being recruited for are back-end developers, cloud engineers, and agile software developer leads. And a really interesting point is that community roles feature in both the top roles recruited for and which are planned to be recruited for over the next few years. So it's an increased focus on the need for that community and developer engagement. So we see a real link between the collaboration, the networks, the working together, the cooperation, the co-opetition that's happening, and what we're looking for in recruitment.
Jen, I love the fact that what we're seeing come out of this is collaboration, contribution emerging as we get into maturity, which in turn leads to the correlation with community roles being recruited. And I think that's something that we see, particularly in the public sector, when we look at the marketplace and we look just at consumption. The facts highlight that journey that goes from consumption to contribution to distribution. And as we move through it and move from consumption to contribution, the maturity really starts to kick in and the benefits really start to kick in. And that's where the key goals that we see, moving away from vendor lock-in, moving to interoperability, moving to code that will be reused and recycled, that's where that really starts to come to the fore and we get true open source, not the sort of legal definition of open source. Now, all of those stages, consumption, contribution, distribution, they impact the attitudes and the behaviors of the organizations using, consuming, contributing, and distributing open source software. So let's work together through these and see what happens to organizations at each stage of the journey.
Sure. So we cut the data by, as Amanda, you just said, consumption only, consumption and contribution, and consumption, contribution, and distribution. And you'll see that in the report. And then we looked across. Now, the first two are quite small groups of respondents, but we still think there is something in there to talk about around the awareness of good practice and governance. So we see one really nice trend is policies and procedures internally in place in organizations. When you're only consuming, only 14% have that. When you're contributing as well, 48%. And by the time you're distributing, it's almost 2/3 have policies and procedures in place. With consumption only, 14% are aware of things like the OIN, but none are members. 14% are aware of open chain, but again, none are members. And none are participating in what's becoming more important around work on standards in open source software or being part of other types of open source software organizations. None in that case have an OSPO. In contributing, we see now 11% have an OSPO, 48%, as I said, policies and procedures in place, 41% require copyright ownership, and again, growing recognition of OIN, but still very low membership. By the time you're distributing, 11% own patents and 18% are aware of open change, with 11% being members. So while that's not a huge number, we see a growing membership there as you start to distribute. So again, the more you're involved in the community, the more realization around how you can be part of, let's say, membership in open source software organizations, which here are 17% and has also shown growth through these 3 points on the journey.
So Jen, we saw a couple of small groups emerge as we really look into that. The first of those was the group who consumed but didn't contribute or distribute. Can we have a chat about that micro survey that emerged?
Yeah, we're calling it a micro survey. We took, it's only 3% in our sample that consumed only, did not contribute to and or distribute open source software. And this number is very small for rigorous data analysis. Results should be interpreted, of course, with caution, but we felt it was worthwhile to show that that group is small for the UK. It's a very small group. That means, we're farther along on our maturity. There is limited engagement with good practices. So, when you're consuming only, you're also not part of this good governance or good hygiene kind of focus.
I will admit that I was surprised by how small that group was, and pleased, of course, but particularly when we look at the fact that almost half of the respondents are not in tech companies. I thought that was particularly pleasing. Now, the second group, and I know this is much more controversial, and I know you don't really want me to talk about them because they are such a small group, but for anybody involved in open source, they are really a red flag, and it's something that we will definitely be going off and trying to do a deeper dive into. And that group is those who consume, who distribute, so really are using open source, but who do not contribute. Can we talk a little bit, and I know it's a tiny group, but can we talk about them?
Yes, it is a very tiny group, and we can't draw any real conclusions from that group. But I see the
But
point.
they exist. They exist, and that's the problem.
They exist, and I think that it's true. I mean, there are a lot of organizations out there that in the past, or those leading organizations that are quite small, that have had other organizations and didn't have a contribution as part of their plan, and couldn't manage how to make that happen and secure things and manage risk. And we note in there that we can see that sometimes around finance organizations, they've been slower to contribute. Lots of times the developers working on this do contribute in their own time, or are able to contribute using their own email address and not the business one. And so they do get a chance to be part of that community. But as what we sort of see, even at this small number, but if we look across and think about some of the conversations we've had around this, is really, organizations being slow or dragging their feet to put policies in place that allow that contribution, but not only allow it, but see the benefits of it. So, many of our case studies talked about that, contributing upstream is so important for good code, for ensuring your own dependencies, for being part of that, ensuring the security and the longevity of the code and what you're building. So yeah, we can't draw any conclusions, but we do want to put it out there as a place for further exploration, and we'll try to find ways to understand more what's happening here and how we move that along.
We see this journey going along the road from consumption to contribution to distribution in the first place. But we also see a journey that happens with length, with duration of usage. And by usage, again, I mean that consume, contribute, or distribute. Can we think about that a little bit, please?
Yeah, I've just thought about bringing up a couple of the outputs from that. We really liked cutting. So what we did was look at a question that asked if you're doing anything, consuming, contributing, distributing, as any interaction, and then how long you've been doing those actions for in this kind of question. And so I like looking at the challenges and the benefits that we see in that. So all of the top challenges, other than if you are doing any of these actions with open source software less than 12 months, so anything from 1 to more than 10 years, are all costs of maintenance and security. That's the top challenge. Below that, at 12 months or less, it's lack of licensing, governance, and good practice knowledge. So it's obvious, but it's important, right? Like, how do you enter in? And the more we can support that entering moment, that early use moment, the better these practices will be. And you can see how that would change the cost of security over time, the cost of maintenance, when you know how to put things in place initially. On the benefit side, we see some cost saving in the early younger years. But as you move into 4+ years of engagement, you see collaboration coming to the fore. 4 to 10 years is collaboration. And then more to 10 years, we're back at cost saving and license fees. I think, again, because we're seeing such a difference in the way open source software is considered, engaged with, talked about in the last decade, we see this sort of sweet spot in there between, let's say, 5 to 10 years of use, where they've been part of this movement. They're looking at the importance of community collaboration, all of the key things we've been talking about for the last number of years. Whereas at more than 10 years, maybe we're just seeing people who've been a long time in it and have had made their own, pathways, right? Have found ways to make things work when there wasn't a community that they're so strong, when there wasn't as strong of a voice.
Yeah, I'm slightly more skeptical on that. I suspect that what's happened is that they have got into patterns of behavior and they haven't continued to engage and adopt. Maybe they're a little bit more reticent about it. And I do think that's something that we need to follow up with as well as time goes by. But you're absolutely right. Picking up the processes gets easier as you become more skilled in it and more used to it. And it becomes the day-to-day hygiene of open source. And we see that in the case studies. They reflect that journey and they give examples of UK organizations using, and I mean consume, contribute, distribute, to open source software. And they span across our everyday lives. They span from our energy providers to our financial services institutions, organizations that we shop with and choose our fashion styles from, all the way through to the BBC, the source of our television, the source of our news. And of course, we see usage in the public sector. Some organizations, particularly the younger ones, are almost entirely built on open source, and they've shifted to it from the early stage. My personal favorite, I think, has to be the BBC usage. And we see that across the whole organization. But in our case study, they draw out a couple of usages. And if you haven't worked out what the wee mouse is doing on the front of the Open UK report this year, on the front cover of State of Open, then read the BBC case study and you'll see that it's part of Springwatch, the BBC TV programme. And in fact, a lot of the wee creatures, whether it's a wee mouse or the starlings and whales on the back cover, those are recorded using open source software. So Jen, do you want to talk a little bit more about some of the case studies?
Sure, I'll just kind of do an overview of what we highlighted. We had two from Scotland, actually. Dumfries and Galloway Council is one, and the Scottish Government is the other. And Dumfries and Galloway Council are consuming open source software for social good through a collaborative open source solution between themselves and the Scottish Tech Army. I think it was amazing to see them moving into new territory, a heavy reliance on volunteers and supporting those volunteers when they're creating these kind of community council sites. And they're doing this for social good and its scalability potential. So it's a way of reaching quite a large number of community councils with one model. And it means bringing everyone, all of the volunteers, up to speed working on this. The Scottish Government has created an analytical workbench, which encourages a cooperation and interoperability between researchers and team members. So being able to manage and bring out and understand data quickly. BBC Research and Development, as Amanda just noted, that's where Springwatch is, but they're transforming traditional broadcasting infrastructure and cloud-based IT platform technologies, allowing the research team to share projects on an open source software structure and using distributed repositories. They sort of realize, they really have a good sense of the importance of contributing upstream to ensure good quality code and the communities that they need to be part of that. And they are really pushing the boundaries and are well known. They're breaking new ground when it comes to traditional broadcasting structures. Skyscanner, everything and anything is open source software for Skyscanner. And of course, they give security a lot of importance. Everything, they are open source software by design, that, everything is embedded in it. Their structures are strong, their security is strong, their good governance is strong as they kind of keep innovating. And of course, for Skyscanner, this is the hallmark of how secure you can be, and also how you can not spend your time as a team working on things that already exist, but rather building what the consumer needs on top of code that's already there and structures that are already there. And so they have a very robust use of open source software and a very robust network, and are very embedded in the kind of innovation and agile sort of speed to impact, getting things done, responding to consumer need quickly via open source software. Nationwide, finance sector struggling a little bit more with the contributing side, but getting there, working on their policies and procedures. They're using open source software as a kind of obvious go-to. It's what they do, container cloud native technologies, databases, observability tools, security, software build tools. Everything that they can. It's just, this is where we go. This is what we do. And they're working hard. And Seiji, who we spoke with at Nationwide, is really trying to lead around standards, around procedures and policies, and around really embedding and making clear the processes that need to be in place to support that. With New Look, we're looking at that next step, curation, infrastructure rebuild. We're seeing that they will use a mix of software, but that they'll use open source software in and through their total digital transformation reboot. So it's at the center of what they're moving forward with. And lastly, and we'll come back to this one as well, is OVO, their domain protect. So they're using serverless functions in the cloud to detect subdomain takeover vulnerabilities. As Simon's described to me, this is a feature that's required internally, but they're able to see how other organizations could use it. So it's a really robust build of a security-focused piece of software.
It's really interesting, Jen. These pick up very nicely on what the work we did last year, where we started to share case studies over the summer in phases 2 and 3. And in particular, when you look at the story of Skyscanner with open source by design, as you said, anything and everything is open source. What we really see there is a very similar story to Starling Bank. And I think that also reflects the fact that we saw 100% utilization of open source in companies under 3 years old. And it reflects the fact that the innovative companies growing in the UK today are really growing with open source from day one. And that journey for them is probably very accelerated. And these very much reflect our vision of international collaboration alongside UK leadership. We have an incredible group of people who have contributed to the report this time. We have Bruce Perrins, the creator of the open source definition, who modestly describes himself as one of the instigators of open source. Eric Brewer, distinguished engineer at Google, talking about curation, a real thought leader who's influencing the US security sector and practices around this at a government level. That curation word is going to be absolutely key. You are going to hear a lot in the next months, years, particularly the next 18 months, I think, about curation as we work out how both the enterprise and our national infrastructure manage open source well. And curation for me, I've thought a lot about this, and it's a journey across a road, and that can be difficult and that can be simple. On the left-hand side of the road, we have communities. Those communities are made up of individuals, they're made up of businesses, they're made up of a combination of the two, all of whom are building the open source software we've come to expect and use day to day. Now, that software will be licensed and get the right to use it will be under a license approved by the Open Source Initiative as meeting the open source definition. So that open source software is something that you can take and use. But of course, one thing that is common in all of those licenses is the disclaimer of liability. There is no legal comeback. There is no legal liability in this open source software that is given to you for free. On the other side of the road is infrastructure. We're not just looking at apps and tools here. We're looking at infrastructure in our enterprises, in digitally transformed enterprises, and in the public sector. And that infrastructure, in some cases, forms our critical national infrastructure. And we have to cross the road. We have to move from that community space, whether it's a business community or an individual community or a mixture. We have to move from that community space with the disclaimer of liability to infrastructure that is well maintained, well managed, and secure. And we have to think a bit there about the equity and the sharing of revenues. But beyond that, we have to think about how we cross that road. And you can cross it, you can curate it in different ways. You can follow a bypass under the road, which is a set piece of work, a very straightforward, a very direct route. And that would be something like the Red Hat subscription model that we also famously know. It's a set piece. It might be that you want to employ someone to curate your journey, your own Sherpa to lead you across the road in the safest way for you, meeting your specific needs. Or you might want to learn how to do it yourself and step by step pick up the skills or hire them so that you can get from one side of the road to the other and curate that well managed, well maintained open source software that has good hygiene, that's going to be safe and secure. Safe and secure is something that matters more in certain environments than others, obviously. We talked about people like Nationwide who are regulated sectors who have an extra layer to think about in their curation. But what we know is that if you try and run across the road headlong into the traffic, it's going to be one of those Wile E. Coyote roadrunner situations. It's going to be an absolute mess, and you are going to end up splattered across the road. So we need to look at curation, and that's where we're going to go with the next phase of our report. We'll be holding an event in September, a day-long event. We'll be working on this with the OpenSSF on the security side. We will bring international and UK speakers, and I hope we'll bring government, devolved and central, together with us to look at curation, to look at infrastructure, to look at security. And we'll do much more of a deep dive on those areas at that day, but also in a report that phase 2 of State of Open will be in that report in September. Now, that usage, Jen, it involves the good hygiene of open source software, something that we've already touched on. But maybe, Jen, you can share some more about that.
Well, I think that we've covered a lot of that in this conversation, but just to say, I mean, the law of diffusion, as I talk about in my conclusion, says that with innovations, you start as an early adopter, and so many early adopters, so many early innovations fall down the chasm and they get lost. And to come back out and to be bold and strong and brave through innovative cycles and to really create products and services that have longevity, you need to build that bridge. So I think it's a really nice that our journey metaphor, our sense of that road, I think is the same as the sort of laws of diffusion, the laws of innovation that say you've got to build that bridge. And those bridges tend to be finding these communities, finding these spaces where you can network, where you can learn from and understand what others are doing, the OIN, Open Chain, which all of them giving you guidance so you're not alone. And I think that's a big piece. So we're seeing a lot of different ways, as you've noted, Amanda, that people get there, but they are moving along that. And often that comes from stepping into the community and realizing that others are doing it. And there are support systems to understand more.
Absolutely, Jen. And that collaboration is critical. Understanding what's already out there and reusing and recycling the good hygiene and good practices is almost as much part of open source as using and recycling the code. And what we start to see in this phase one of our report is the start of that deep dive into security and into standards. So Andrew Martin, our Open UK CISO, as also going to speak today at this event. He has written a couple of pages as a report. There is some output from our question in the survey around security, and of course there's some great case studies. We also see Simon Phipps, the standards director at the OSI, start to talk about the impact that standards have on open source, the focus on having open standards. And then there's a little bit of friction that's going to need sorted out where we have issues with FRAND licensing not working with open source. And that's something that we'll also dive into. But of course, for Open UK, one of the critical things is sustainability. And we want to make sure that the role of open technologies, the role of open source software is elevated in the sustainability story. And we'll also be hosting an event in Edinburgh on the 16th of November. It will be our second Open Technology for Sustainability Day. And that for us will be where we share phase 3, which will focus on sustainability. Now, Jen, I mentioned standards, and one of my favorite case studies that we haven't talked about is by Judy Parnell at the BBC. And Judy talks about fake news.
Yeah, so Judy talked to us about in BBC R&D, they started a conversation to create a standard to authenticate published news stories. And, this is a massive impact on the sector. And they identified that they needed to co-create and collaborate with other leaders, in effect, their competitors, to have the wider impact on the project. They have an amazing and a website up about who is involved and why and how and what those sort of benefits are. And they're building something that really has to take in risk to the people involved, risk to those authentication sources. It's a massive project and so important. And I thought it was worthwhile to just quote something that Judy said. And she said, the benefit of working in the open source world is you're immediately lowering your barriers to entry. You've got a lot more people coming in and getting involved. These are people with skills who are doing this with a passion. These are the people who push things forward.
Jen, I want to say thank you. I want to thank you for continuing to partner with us and for joining us today, actually. In a few moments, we're going to move to questions and see what's come through from the audience. But before we do that, just a few pieces to wrap up. So for more information about Open UK's events, the events that I've mentioned, and the latest stages of this report, follow us on Twitter, OpenUK_UK. Follow us on LinkedIn and sign up to our newsletter on our website, openuk.uk. We're able to do the great work that we do thanks to our sponsors, of whom there are very many, but we're just sharing with you now some of our core sponsors whose general sponsorship has allowed this report to happen. As well as our partners at Smooth Media, who Jen's already thanked and to whom I'm really grateful, we've got an Open UK team who work on this reporting. And that includes George Berham, who is our marketing manager, Georgia Cook, our creative director, Amy Howlett, our support manager, and Stephen Pritchard, who helps us with our AV. During this process, we've had a number of people who've had COVID themselves and through their families, and it was not easy getting this out by the 7th of July. So thank you to everybody who participated and who made this happen. I'm really incredibly grateful to you. And thank you to each of you. Thank you to everybody who did a case study, who contributed quotes. We have some amazing expertise scattered throughout the report. You'll hear from some of those people shortly today. And I hope that all of you enjoy joining us today and your report drinks. Thank you.